Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host Kevin, and today we're going to talk about Irish history with Dr. Oisin McIlvaney sitting in his car right there. Oisin, how are you doing, brother?
Doing grand, yeah.
Yep. Why are you sitting in your car?
Uh, don't have access to my office at the moment, and can't go home because I have a nephew over there, and he's 18 months,
Yep.
very cute but very loud, So,
Yes, they are. They are. How did you find driving on the wrong side of the road when you came back from the States?
it was fine for me. It wasn't fine for the fella driving right ahead of me.
Yeah, it's weird going back and forth. I've done it a couple of times, and it's just strange. There's not that many countries that drive on that side of the road. I mean, England, Ireland, Australia. Yeah, yeah. There's a few still. Yeah,
I mean, like to be honest, with you, it's nice to actually have a good car. I mean, when I drove in the US, I had a 1998 Lincoln Town
you
Car.
did. It was a beast. It looked like a boat. It was like a big boat.
Some people call like their cars after like women, like Isabel, Arlene. I call mine Rolling Probable Cause because that thing was.
Yeah, you had some adventures on that in that car, man. But hey, it hung in there. Did a lot of driving. Yep. I have a Ford F-150, and people, all these overlanders, and they're all Toyota people, Toyota Tacomas, and all that. I tell you, I love that truck. I have 177,000 miles on that truck, and it's been awesome. It's been a great truck, and it's completely built out now for the range because I spend a lot of time in the range. But anyway, what are we talking about today, Oshin?
We're talking about the Irish Civil War.
Okay, you love this subject.
Yeah,
You love this subject, yeah. What in particular? Anything in particular?
yeah. So we'll be looking at obviously the cause of the Civil War, and then sort of I suppose I wouldn't call it the highlights, but the darker days of it. Uh, Probably the most heinous crime during it was the Ballyseedy massacre, which we'll talk about as well.
Yeah, and you would think that was like the British, but it wasn't. It was the Irish killing the Irish.
Yeah,
Yeah, every country has dark, dark past, right? Every country in the world has some darker than others, but they got these little dark pieces and that massacre was particularly brutal. It's hard to imagine that would happen. Um, you get rid of the British and then you start fighting each other. But all right, go ahead. Let's do a broad overview of the Irish Civil War for people who just don't know.
yeah. So after the bulk of the fighting was done during the War of Independence, there was an offer of a truce.
What years are we talking about here? Sorry.
So end of 1921, start of 1922. So there was a peace delegation put together to discuss the truce. Now, bear in mind, this is in the context of very heavy guerrilla warfare and the British taking massive personal losses. And to be quite frank, if you look at it in the history of the British Empire at the time, it was really the first sign of sort of a crack, so to speak.
Mm.
So a delegation was put together, and Michael Collins was selected by Eamon de Valera to go over and discuss, along with other people, um, the terms of the truce. Now, there's a lot of romanticism and I suppose glossing over with regards to the Irish Civil War. People like to look at it in very, very simplistic views. Like, for example, I love the Michael Collins film done by Neil Jordan, but it's not very historically accurate. On one side, Collins wasn't just you know, on a totally militaristic figure. On the other side, De Valera wasn't just like some backstabbing politician. I think it was a lot more nuanced than that. I think I think there were certainly egos at play here. Collins definitely did not want to be part of the delegation. And when you think about it, it makes sense. Like Collins was a shadowy figure, director of IRA intelligence, head of the Supreme Council of the IRB, which is, I suppose, analogous to the CIA nowadays. An intelligence organization. And you know, uh, basically Collins was very, very reluctant, but he went essentially on orders from the president of Ireland, which was Eamon de Valera. He was the president of the provisional government. And De Valera had come back to Ireland. He had missed most of the brutal fighting of the War of Independence. He had gone over on a goodwill tour towards the United States to promote the idea that there was an Irish president, because that was unheard of at the time. You know, we were a colony essentially, a subject to a British monarchy, and he went over to America, our biggest sponsor, you know, and had discussed at length with Irish American and the America at large about the prospect of an Irish Republic. And that was very important. I mean, I wouldn't underplay it. I mean, like, he raised millions in funds for the war, and he promoted the idea that we actually had our own self-identity. But when he came back, he realized that Collins had effectively been running the War of Independence and was seen by most as the true leader. And that obviously was a big problem for De Valera. And not only for him, but for other people who were involved in the Republican movement, like people like Cathal Brugha. Again, Cathal Brugha was a total veteran. I mean, like, that guy was in the Easter Rising. He was shot multiple times and survived. He barely escaped execution. He was a big player in the IRA in the War of Independence, but he and De Valera were not real large members of the IRB. They'd been sworn in, but they weren't like the heads of the IRB. And so they kind of viewed the IRB and Collins as the head of it as usurping the democratic will of the Provisional Irish Government and the open military organization, which was the IRA. So they kind of saw them as a challenge of power, so to speak, you know. And I think that De Valera rightfully had he rightfully had the, I suppose, the title of being probably the best political strategist and negotiator in the Irish political scene for at that time, and probably for many years to come, including in World War II. Like, Lloyd George used to describe him as negotiating with De Valera was trying to pick up mercury with a fork. That he was very, very good at his job. And I think he sent Collins over, and this is only in my opinion. Like, nothing's written down. This is my opinion. I think he sent Collins over to some degree, devalue Collins' status. That he would go over there, and I think De Valera really didn't think anything would be agreed to. I think it would have ended in failure, and Collins would have come back dejected. It had failed, and De Valera could step into the fore and say, "Well, I'm the political strategist here." You know.
Mhm.
Now, that's not what happened. Collins went over, and I think Collins, you know, being a pragmatist, you know, he agreed to the truce. I think that shocked De Valera. I think it shocked quite a number of other people. But amongst Collins, and surprisingly enough, a lot of the true military minds in the anti-treaty IRA, the truce was generally welcomed. I think it was welcomed in the minds of the anti-treaty IRA and, sorry, what would become the anti-treaty IRA, and Collins himself as sort of a respite, an ability a chance to regroup and rearm and then re-engage the enemy. Kind of like the Second Tet Offensive, agreeing to something and then going back for another bit, you know?
Mhm.
And Collins said himself, he says, it's not the ultimate freedom all nations aspire and develop, but the freedom to achieve freedom. So, in other words, it was a stepping stone.
Mhm.
Coincidentally, he also realized that this was going to put him in a very difficult situation, and famously said, today I've signed my death warrant," you know?
Mhm.
And, you know, unfortunately, he was correct, because by accepting the truce, he had to accept two major conditions that would put him at odds with two separate forces in Irish Republican sort of politics. Number one, it wouldn't be a true republic in the sense that they'd have to take an oath of allegiance to a foreign king or queen. So they'd have to take the British oath of allegiance. Now, this was totally an anathema to anything along the lines of the Republicans that had really done a lot of the hard fighting in the guerrilla war. So a lot of people in the South, particularly in Cork, they were very, very much against this. Like, I mean, for example, there is a gentleman who's comes to prominence here, is a guy called Liam Lynch. Liam Lynch was Second Cork Brigade. He was a Limerick man, though, and he was very close to Mike Collins. In fact, both the men were on the Supreme Council of the IRB, so very high up in the secret organization, you know, the Fenian organization. And Liam Lynch, when he had heard that he'd have to take an oath to a foreign king or queen, he famously said, "We have declared for an Irish Republic and we will live under no other law." Now, that being said, Lynch wasn't like a fundamentalist or an ideologue like many would paint him, sort of in the broad strokes of Irish history. Liam Lynch, like Collins, was a pragmatist. Now, he being on the same Supreme Council did not want a civil war. In fact, Lynch and Collins set up a army reunification committee where Collins would rewrite the constitution to be a republican constitution, remove any mention of monarchy or sovereignty or whatever. And Lynch agreed to it. Lynch agreed in essence to this rewritten republican constitution. Now the British came in immediately and said, no, if you do that, we're going to come in with total war and we're going to try and wipe you out. Now, again, the other aspect, which that really put things on a knife's edge, and the other aspect which also put pressure on Collins was the partition of the North. 6 counties in the North, which were predominantly Unionist or loyalist, and with a Protestant kind of majority, were kept under British control. Now, the British did this for two reasons. One was economic, because there was shipbuilding there was the linen industry. And secondly, and more importantly, it was a strategic stronghold and a foothold in Ireland, because they believed, whether through economic sanctions, which they implemented, or through a civil war, which they most certainly fermented and probably caused, I would say, in many respects, that the 26 counties would crumble, and that the 6 counties would be there just to swoop in afterwards and then reunify under British rule.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, broad strokes, people would say Collins totally abandoned the North and neglected the North. Now, that's not correct either. Collins actually was very, very, very instrumental in dealing with the Northern division of the IRA. Now, people like Ono Duffy and Roger McCorley, who were hardliners, people who had killed considerable amount of people during the War of Independence, and were, I suppose people would call them diehards. Now, it's important that the British wanted to cause further fraction between him and these members of the IRA by setting off a series of pogroms in them. So in the 1920s, in 1922, in the North, they set off massive pogroms, which was enabled and basically
What's that word you used?
pogrom.
What's that mean?
Ethnic cleansing. So
Oh,
yeah, so there was episodes of ethnic cleansing in the North that were facilitated by the British Army and the B Special. Now the B Special would be the forefathers of the UDR. So very much like the people that came after them, they were involved in some notable atrocities against the civilian population. So in particular, things that stood out were things like the McMahon killing, where the B Specials, again, these are supposedly members of the police force or the military police force out there. They killed a family of 6 in their beds. The only reason that it was known is because one of the 12-year-olds they tried to kill survived and was able to describe them. They obviously they didn't suffer any consequence of it. Further killings like the Annan street killings, 5 beaten to death by B Specials. Out of the hundreds that were killed during 1 year alone, only 12 were alleged to be IRA supporters. And when I say supporters, not volunteers, and I say alleged because the other ones were killed on the basis of being suspected papists, as in suspected Catholics. That's a sectarian ethnic, So out of this, Collins set up what was known as the Ulster Council with Roger McCorley and Ono Duffy, with secret plans to invade the North. Now, again, this wasn't known to the wider Republican movement at the time, because it's all very secretive. It's all very much IRB led, and that secrecy kind of plays against him, because in history people would have thought that he abandoned the North, and I don't think that's fair of Collins' character. Now, basically, the person behind the pogroms, or behind the ethnic cleansing in the North, was a particular odious character called the Field Marshal Henry Wilson. He was an MP and was in charge of military actions in the newly founded Northern.
MP is a member of Parliament, right?
And he'll play probably the defining moment in kicking off the Civil War. Now, to make things even worse for Collins is that not only is he under massive pressure, he is, his own fellow members of the Cork IRA brigade, he's from Cork himself, are against him because of this oath of allegiance. His attempts to unify the army by rewriting the constitution have been dashed by the British, who are threatening severe total war if he does so. And on top of that, they're instigating ethnic cleansing in the north. So there's further fractions between him and the Northern IRA. So he's in a very, very difficult position. Now, the worst possible thing happens at this point. Um, a breakaway group of the anti-treaty IRA, formed of senior IRA officers, led by a guy called Rory O'Connor. Again, an absolute hardened veteran of the Easter Rising, War of Independence, and so on from Dublin, led anti-treaty IRA members to occupy the Four Courts in Dublin. And that's our Supreme Court. It's probably the most prominent building we have in the city. And, again, it's important to note that they weren't doing this to strike at Collins. They weren't doing this to strike at people who were in the Free State Army or as they saw it in the pro-treaty IRA. They did it because they believed that the British would attack them if they took this big building, and that would reunify the Irish forces together, and they would have a common enemy. And they were actually correct in their assumption. I mean, that was on the plans to actually attack. The British were planning to attack the Four Courts. Neville Macready, who's again very much involved in World War II after this, said the British intentionally planned to do an aerial bombardment of Dublin City. And we know any aerial bombardment of an urban area, mass casualties,
Mm-hmm.
But they were trying to force Collins to do it himself. Now Collins, this is very telling. This capture of the Four Courts happened in April. Collins didn't act on this until late June. He was trying his best to hold out. He was trying his best to avoid a civil war. But things just continued to happen outside of his control. So the ethnic cleansing in the north ramped up. Henry Wilson was actively pursuing this sort of, I suppose, expulsion of Irish and Catholic out of the north to create a wholly Protestant state. And Collins did what, heads of intelligence do. He organized his assassination. So Henry Wilson was getting out on a lovely Sunday morning out of a taxi in London. And two men stepped up to him, Reginald Dunn and Joseph O'Sullivan, two World War I veterans of the Somme, and both committed IRA members and IRB members as well. They shot him multiple times in broad daylight. They tried to make their escape. Reginald Dunn, however, because he had lost his leg in the Somme, couldn't make it very far, and they were captured. British intelligence linked them to a gentleman called Sam Maguire, which, funny enough, is named after our
Yeah, I've heard that name. Yeah, the cup, the Sam Maguire Cup, right? Yeah.
So Sam Maguire has an interesting history. Like, Sam Maguire is head of IRA intelligence in London. He's also the centre of the IRB circle in London, and he's the man who recruited Michael Collins in the first place to the IRB. There's always been a close connection between him and Collins. So while there's no definitive proof, when Collins heard of Henry Wilson's death, it was reported he seemed very pleased. And it was most likely that Collins organized the killing himself. Now, that being said, the British didn't see it that way. This was a massive upset for them. Just to put it in context, since that point, the last time an MP has been assassinated by anybody was Airey Neave by the Republicans in 1979, blown up in Parliament.
Yeah, it's like a congressman. It's like a congressman in America, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a big deal, and basically they blame the anti-treaty IRA, and they had just taken the Four Courts. So the British said, okay, we're going to go in with an air assault. So we're going to bomb the city of London, of Dublin by air. We're going to bring in tanks, and we're going to bring in howitzers. And Collins decided, and I think he made a mistake, but he decided he was going to manage it himself. He borrowed the artillery from the British Army, and he set his people to do that task. And lo and behold, began the Battle of Dublin. Over 250 people were killed during that conflict, quite a lot of civilians as well as prominent members of the IRA. In particular, Cal Brugha was shot coming out of a hotel. That set things off on a very nasty course. And in earnest, the Civil War began. So by the end of, I would say, July 5th, Dublin was really under control of Collins and the Free State Army.
So not only a few years after the Easter Rising, where Collins was he in the Four Courts in the Easter Rising, or was he in GPO?
PO.
In the GPO, right? And he was shelled by the British. Now he's on the other side, and he's shelling Irish. Yeah, it's crazy. If you walk past the Four Courts today, there's still like bullet holes and cannon marks on it, and GPO as well. They're still all there. You can see them if you're in Dublin. Yeah.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, that's a great thing about Dublin. Like, I mean, you can walk through places, and there may not be signs up about it, but if you know your history, you're able to pick out the interesting spots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But so like, you know, the very there's a couple of things that changed the course of the Civil War and increases sort of ferocity. So up until that point, up until like, the shelling of the Four Courts, up until like July of that year, there was a stipulation. If you were to join the National Army or the Free State Army, you had to be a former member of the IRA. You had to be an IRA volunteer, and you had to make that oath to the Republic. They got rid of that. They realized we're going for a big war. We're going to need everyone we can get. So they started taking all the demobilized troops from the British Army into the Free State Army.
Mm-hmm.
So that changed the dynamic very quickly. And it was bad news for the anti-treaty IRA because they're viewing it very much along the lines of, look, not only do they have massive numbers now, and they have all the weapons that the British are supplying them, they also have members of the IRA themselves who sided with Collins, um, who knew their tactics and their techniques, and it was going to be a really bloody war.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, and the opposite side of that, like, I mean, a lot of the very experienced guerrilla leaders sided on the anti-treaty side as well. I mean, at least at the start, I mean, like Liam Lynch, while not as widely known as people like Tom Barry, who wrote a book, or Dan Breen, who wrote a book, Liam Lynch was a very effective guerrilla warfare leader. Like, he killed 13 elite soldiers in Mill Street. He organized lots of hit and run tactics. He was probably Collins's counterpart in rural guerrilla warfare, really.
Mm.
And like, people like Tom Barry and Dan Breen were also anti-treaty, but I think a lot of them got demoralized very quickly by having to kill their own people,
Mm.
and they more or less kind of stood out of it. And like, I think Liam Lynch, what he realized Dublin was under Collins' control, he really wanted to hold parts of Munster, like Collins' stronghold originally, Cork and Kerry, as like a Munster Republic, let's just say. And there was some fierce, fierce, bloody fighting between um, the Free State forces and the anti-treaty IRA.
Did the Free State forces have the support of the people generally?
No, so I mean, see, the thing is, I think the people at that point were very, very like there's war fatigue. I mean, like, and when it's on your doorstep, it happens quickly. I mean, like, they had just gone through a very brutal war with all the reprisals from the auxiliaries, the Black and Tan, and so on. And now they're seeing this. I mean, I think most people, including even Liam Lynch himself, they wanted to avoid civil war at all costs.
Mm-hmm.
And it just happened, unfortunately, and it just snowballed out of control. I think certain things, you know, certain things were just unforgivable that happened during the Civil War. Like, for example, uh, it's kind of hard in sort of, it's because it's not too long ago to put in your mind, but it's amazing to see after the Civil War how certain people were able to forgive and to go into politics alongside or against people who had been trying to kill them, for quite some period of time.
Yeah.
So, like, for example, Sean Lamass, who was a member of Collins' squad, became an anti-treaty member of the IRA. His younger brother, Noel Lamass, who wasn't involved in anything really, was captured by members of that squad, brought to the Dublin Mountains, and tortured to death.
Mm.
And Lamass became a Fianna Fáil politician and went into politics and was facing people from, let's just say, Fine Gael, who may have been involved in his brother's murder every day. He
Yeah.
to them.
Yeah. You can see both sides. Like if you step back and just look at it from the 10,000 foot view, you can see the anti-argument. It's tough to take a note to the British Empire, right? After all the years and all the people you lost and all the atrocities committed. On the other side, if you look at it as a stepping stone and a way to build up and strengthen yourself to launch into the north, that's a separate argument, right? You can see both sides, but I think once one atrocity is done, then violence begets violence, and it just snowballs again. And you're one upping each other, and you're sitting around drinking beer and ramping each other up, and oh, look what they did, they're freaking, and you reacting to them, and then they react to you, and then that's how things get out of control. Yeah, you can see it. It was very. I mean, I learned a lot of Irish history, obviously, in school, but a lot of this was very sugar coated. The really nasty stuff wasn't really thought that I remember. Right, there's just so much Irish history. It goes back for a friggin' millennia, right? But I don't remember learning the nitty gritty violent part. I think it would have been the government. You know, Collins would have been the good guy. These would have been the bad guy. It was never kind of looked at. And I like to look at history from both sides, right? I look at the American Civil War from both sides because it gives you a better understanding of it. This was, both sides had an argument and they just couldn't come to terms, and one violent act led to another, and it just, that's what happens, I guess, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I think to a certain extent it was very much a tit for tat kind of violence
Mm.
up until a certain point. I think up until Collins's death, it was tit for tat.
Mm.
I mean, I think, like, for example, a gentleman called Sean McHales was killed. They rounded up uh, several members of the anti-treaty IRA, four of them, Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, McKelvey, and Barrett, and they executed them. And, there's a lot of assassinations, a lot of counterattacks and ambushes. But when Collins was killed, and there's a lot of talk about what he was doing, going down to what was at that time the Munster Republic.
Mm.
I think he was going down there for negotiations. I personally think that's what happened, and he was ambushed and he was killed. Um, and when you think about it, Collins died the 22nd of August, 1922, and his second in command, a guy called Arthur Griffiths, had died just a week before from a brain hemorrhage. So, that kind of moral aspect of Collins, like that kind of the direction that he was going in, disappeared overnight. And you had people who were very loyal to Collins and were enraged that he'd been killed.
Mm.
And people like Paddy Daly in particular. Now, Paddy Daly was the odd one out when it came down to Mike Collins' squad. So Mike Collins' squad was usually men in their mid to late 20s, were not to be married, not to have kids. This was a full-time job. You do not expect to survive this. This is, you're going to be an elite unit. Go out there. Paddy Daly was a widower with like 5 kids. He was like getting close to 40. Like that guy was a diehard. He was in it till the end. And he did an awful lot of assassinations during the War of Independence. So when Collins died, he was kind of bereft. He had the person that he had believed in was gone, and he took out that vengeance on the anti-treaty IRA to a point where it was disproportionate. I mean, like, so he was sent in there to sort out the Munster Republic, and that he did. Just to give a highlight, like it'd be too long to go into all the atrocities of the Civil War, but the official, just a brief overview of it would be the official executions of IRA prisoners by the Free State Force was 77, and then there was a further 153 unofficial assassinations where they were just
Murdered.
murdered. Yeah.
Yeah. Were the assassinations hanging, or were they shot?
Oh, they varied it up. Like, I mean, like,
Yeah.
it up. I mean, like, for example, I suppose the best thing to talk about would be the Ballyseedy massacre. And again, Paddy Daly plays this huge role in it. Like, that was March of this is very late, again, very late in the war. So this is in March 1923.
Mm.
Basically, they were finding it very difficult to get into this Munster Republic. There were IEDs everywhere, and 5 Free State soldiers were killed by an IED in County Kerry in a place called Knocknagoshel. And this was the highest singular loss of Free Stater life in over a year. And Paddy Daly was outraged. And Paddy Daly said, "I'm taking the kid gloves off at this point." Now, what most people would think is we're going to devise a plan to hit these fellas hard. Instead, Paddy Daly went to Treaty Barracks, where they had 9 IRA men who had just been recently tortured with hammers by a guy called Nelligan, who was Collins' spy in the castle. Like, these heroes from the War of Independence were becoming villains.
Mm-hmm.
And So I mean, like, I don't think it's simple to say that, but like, they were like Collins himself used to talk about torture, and like he said, like, essentially it debases the man as much as it debases the victim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of truth to that. So these men have been tortured with hammers for a few days. Most of their fingers and hands were broken. They were brought to a crossroad in a place called Ballyseedy and were tied to landmines and they were detonated. Now, one man actually survived that.
How 9 people? Was it 9 people?
9 people were tied to landmines
Wow.
and they were set off.
Wow. That's a horrific way to die. I mean, I think these guys just got used to violence. They just got immune to it, which happens. But that's pretty horrific to do on your own countrymen.
Yeah, and I think to be honest,
It's actually pretty horrific to do it to anybody, but your own countrymen especially. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, like, and bear in mind, you said something about the Civil War in America, and like I love American history. I love the Civil War history.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Yeah.
Very interesting. I mean, like but the thing is, there was a separation of states. Like, I mean, by and large, it wasn't as close as the Irish Civil War. This was really families. Like, these are brothers
Yeah.
and brothers, cousins maybe, but like usually it was very, very close and very, very ugly. I mean, like they would have the reason why they brought people like Paddy Daly into it, and people like from the elite unit from the Dublin squad, the Collins assassination unit. Number one, they were ruthless and they were effective, and they were very good at their job at killing. But essentially, they didn't know the people in the area as well. There was
Yeah.
a bit of distance there. But like they blew up 9 of these people, but one actually survived. He actually got blown away from the actual landmine.
Mm.
A field. They didn't actually know he had died, and they put out this cover story that these people ran into a landmine while trying to escape.
Yeah.
And Stephen Fuller survived, lived to tell the tale, and he became a Fianna Fáil politician and went to government and, was across the cabinet from the people who tried to kill him.
Wow. Yeah.
Difficult. I wouldn't be as forgiving,
No.
but it's a depressing kind of thing because if you look at what happened there, 5 other IRA men died in a very similar fashion in Killarney, and there was a lot more being killed by being attached to landmines, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
To us, as long as our people are being killed by landmines, we're going to do this to you people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's psychological warfare too, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I just wonder how, the IRA, the IRB can fight the British Army to a standstill and have them leave, but the anti-treaty IRA can't fight the Free State to a standstill, right? They're losing. And that's why I asked the question about if they had the support of the population, because that's the kicker right there. If you have that, you win. If you don't have that, you lose when you're in guerrilla war, right? But I'm or maybe there just wasn't as many of them on the anti-treaty side.
But I think it's a combination of things. I think you're right about support. I mean, like, I'll give you an example. Like, the Catholic Church was against the anti-treaty IRA. Now, they're against the IRA in general, but the Catholic Church kind of went with the status quo, and I think a lot of people go with the status quo mostly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Even today, I mean, it's not the Catholic Church anymore, but it's whatever people are saying is right. I'll go ahead with that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's why the media has such an influence on people, because they can steer people in the direction they want, right? It's propaganda basically, and it's worse today than it ever was. But people don't want to rock the boat. That's generally the way it is.
Yeah, it was interesting though, because like when they were on their absolute knees, and like this, like during the height of all these sort of atrocities, the murders and everything else, by the Free State forces, they still got 33% of the vote in the national election.
Wow.
Which meant there was a certain element in Irish, like the Irish mentality, where they're like, you know what, despite everything else, we're going to go against the grain on you, and we're still sticking to the sort of Republican principle.
Yeah.
Which is a very interesting aspect, Now, that being said, there's a lot of things against them. I think that a big part of it was that the people who were really fighting them knew absolutely all their tactics and techniques, and then on top of that, they had all the money and resources given to them by the British government.
Yeah.
Wipe out.
And they knew who they were. There was no, yeah, they're not anonymous. Like they knew their names, they knew who they were, knew what they looked like. Pretty much, that's a tough fight. Yeah, yeah,
And like really, to be honest, the only like, well, people sort of always put it like they think of Civil War, they think of Collins and De Valera. In reality, like most of the atrocities happened after Collins had been killed, and De Valera really wasn't involved in any of the militaristic aspects of the anti-treaty IRA. It was really Liam Lynch.
mm.
So much so when Liam Lynch got killed on the 10th of April in 1923, more or less after that, his second in command, Frank Aiken,
Yep.
Aiken Barrack namesake.
Yeah, the barracks I was stationed at and trained at in Dundalk is Aiken Barracks. I actually remember they named it, and I didn't know who he was. I was like, I don't know who this guy is. It's funny, I've said this before, but when I was in the infantry in Ireland, we used to go to the funerals of old IRA guys from like the 20s, and I'd fire shots, give them a full military funeral, and fire shots over the grave of old IRA guys from back in the day. Like this would have been in the 80s when they were all dying, you know. And then we're naming barracks after these guys too. It's funny, I was stationed at Curra too for a couple of years, and I didn't know that the armored vehicle that was escorting Collins when he got killed, that's still there. Yeah, somebody sent me a thing on Instagram and said that vehicle, it's like an armored old World War One armored vehicle with like a Vickers machine gun on it or something. It's still there in a museum apparently. You know, somebody can put a comment down if you've seen it, but I don't know. It'd be super cool to go see that now, 100 years later, you know, or more. Yeah, was the media involved in persuading people one way or the other, like the national papers?
So there, it went on both sides. There's great propaganda on both sides. The chief propagandist for the anti-treaty IRA was a guy called Erskine Childers. Now, that guy deserves a podcast all on his own. It's one thing to be Irish and being beaten down and then rising up against your oppressor and establishing your own country, etc. It's another thing being a person from the Anglo-Irish background, a person who actually had all the benefits of, like, colonizing the area, turning around and saying, this isn't right, and I identify as Irish and I want to establish an Irish Republic for these people.
Mm-hmm.
And Erskine Childers is one of those people. Erskine Childers was a British soldier. He was really to be honest with you, the tough, steely kind of British person that built their empire. And he turned around and saw the deprivation in Ireland and realized that this was wrong, and became a very integral member of the IRB and the IRA. He and his wife brought in the first guns into Howth during the gun run.
Wow.
And later on, he became a major propagandist for the anti-IRA volunteers, and so much so that people like Winston Churchill made it basically his goal to have him executed.
Wow.
They're really after him because he understood the British psyche. He understood how things could be phrased and put in propaganda.
So I'm sorry, Ushin, which side was he on?
He was on the anti-treaty IRA.
Anti-treaty. Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So he really understood, the whole method of propaganda, and he was very effective. Like, he would make points that, what's the difference of Collins or a Tan? Basically, they're both using British guns to kill you, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
propaganda can be extremely effective if it's done right. Yeah, especially back then, and it's all newspapers, obviously, pushing that stuff out. Yeah. How did Lynch get killed?
Killed in action.
Yeah.
They actually thought they had killed De Valera. Lynch, they're both tall, very tall individuals, about 6'4".
Mm-hmm.
And they thought they reported back they had killed Eamon De Valera, and reality had killed Liam Lynch, who was far more effective. Like, he was, to be honest, if you kill De Valera, I'm not saying that wouldn't have any impact, but kill Liam Lynch, you stop the war right there.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Childers. So he was on the anti-treaty side for propaganda. What about the treaty side? What were they using for propaganda?
Well, they had quite a number of. They had actual press. So they had. Funny enough, they were using the same means of propaganda the British were using during the War of Independence. So they were using the Irish Times, so to speak,
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny because like De Valera sorry, Mike Collins famously dismantled the printing presses in the Irish Times because of their British propaganda, and then later on, his side is using it to
Yeah.
push out propaganda.
That's still today. The Irish Times is the big newspaper, right? Well, internet now, I guess. But um, say again.
It could also be a good source of propaganda too.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously. Yeah. Um,
But Childers, unfortunately, they caught up with him. They were going to assassinate him, and he's only one of two people I know during this whole series of assassinations. He refused a blindfold, number one. He asked his son to shake the hands of every man who's going to kill him.
mm.
And the fellows who are about to shoot him were shaking. He says, "Don't worry, boys. Take a step forward. You won't miss that way."
Wow. Balls. Big balls right there. Yeah.
The only person I can think of who is slightly similar to that was Tomas McBride. Sorry, John McBride. Sorry, John McBride, the South African commando, an IRA and IRB member who fought in 916, where he refused a blindfold and he said, "I don't need a blindfold. I've looked down the barrel of British guns in the African War. Do your job." And that was
Mm.
that was
I
it.
don't get the blindfold. It's not like you don't know what's coming. I don't get it. But yeah, you could be surprised.
I think it's more for the people who are shooting you.
Probably. Yeah. 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 Okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
So you know, uh, Liam Lynch, he was killed, and like weeks after that, Aiken basically he was pragmatic. He just said, "Look, this is futile. We're just killing each other here," and he accepted means of surrender and a truce. But again, that being said, Aiken, while being pragmatic, again, that doesn't make him a softie. Like Aiken was a very tough individual, and like you wouldn't hear it from like a Fianna Fáil politician nowadays, like not by a long shot, but at the time he was part of this newly formed party Fianna Fáil under De Valera, and he said, "Oh, sure, Fianna Fáil and the IRA are two arms of the same chair,"
Hmm.
and he was a physical force Republican. People like Sean Lamass referred to Fianna Fáil as the barely constitutional party, in the sense that we still have the whiff of cordite about us,
Hmm.
and their selling point is that we're a Republican party. We'll try and get a united Ireland, etc., etc. And getting at the time probably more pressing. We want to get rid of this oath of allegiance, which successfully the Irish government did do. So they slowly but surely chipped away at it from a political point of view, and we became a de facto republic and an
Hmm.
actual republic. And but unfortunately, the whole end result of this is that you still have six counties in the north partitioned. You had about 30 years of severe conflict known as the Troubles. Um, and even today, it's a source of mass instability um, in the Irish Republic.
Hmm.
It's a political. It's not be running down anyone in the north, but I think everyone would say that the political situation in the north, even now, is a bit of a disaster.
Yeah. It's funny when I was in the Irish Army and stationed on the border, when there was stuff going on like riots or extraditions or anything very political like that. Sometimes we would go out on border patrols and Land Rovers on a Saturday evening, let's say, and we tried not to drive through town because people would be drunk, it's Saturday night, but they'd be calling us Free State bastards. Still, right? 60 years after, you know what I mean? Calling us Free State bastards and throwing bottles at us. People still hold on to that.
And it's weird because the northern division of the IRA were very like, I mean, them and Collins were like this. In fact, when Roger McCorley, the head of the Belfast IRA at the time, said, it's quite sad. He says the moment Collins died, the hopes of getting rid of partition also died.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because nobody else was going to do the work. Was that it?
And
Yeah.
well, there was that, but like there was lots of like, I mean, I think politicians will generally disappoint you, but I mean, like people in South Armagh up until the 60s and 70s, well, let's say early 60s, I'd say, still kind of half-heartedly believe like Frank Aiken, who was a South Armagh man himself, would actually lead the Irish army into the north at some point, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like basically we have a political quagmire up there at this point as a result of all this.
Yeah. You know, the Irish Army, like when I was in the infantry, you know, we had the FNFAL, which was a great rifle at the time. And I remember an NCO telling me we got these rifles in I think in I can't remember, early 70s or something, when we thought we'd need them. So there was still a lot of that. We're gonna because all the civil rights abuses of Catholics in the north, and there was a lot of talk about the Irish Army invading the north at the time to protect Catholics, you know, and that's probably why the British pumped in the British Army, you know. But the whole thing, you know, it's very difficult to look back, you know, in hindsight and the benefit of hindsight and the knowledge and say whether or not it was the right thing to do by Collins, you know.
I would say one thing though. I think the effects of it are long lasting, even to today. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, like a lot of um, the economic pressure put on by the British government on the Irish government, for example, you know, forced Ireland into a state of great poverty for most of its free existence. Like up until 80s and 90s, Ireland was an incredibly poor
I
country.
know. I grew up in it. I know. Yeah, we were. Very poor, and jobless, and um,
And you know,
just
our currency was the punt. Well, it's great to have your own currency, but it was directly linked with the British pound. They could totally destabilize our currency in the morning if they wanted to, which
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
the one positive selling point for Ireland and getting the euro as our currency is it gave us that degree of separation
Yeah.
economically from the British, which you know led to a large part of the I suppose the economic upsurge in Ireland at the moment, you know, or
Mm-hmm.
at least for the Celtic Tiger period, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, talk to me about Irish politics right now, right? You have Fianna Fáil, you have Fine Gael, you have Sinn Féin are the three big parties, right? And they share power, right? Like I lived in Ireland, I never voted once. I lived there when I was 25, but I never voted once that I can remember. But because to me, they're all just the same people, generally. But is there a difference in the parties? And there's power sharing type thing going on, right? It's not like a definitive party is in charge, basically, like in the States, right?
Yeah. So like in the States, yeah, it's funny you say that. At one point, it used to be like that. So I mean, like for a very long period of time, and again, it's direct result of the Irish Civil War. The anti-treaty Republican side was seen as Fianna Fáil, and the pro-treaty side was seen as Fine Gael.
Mm.
That that's a broad generalization, but that's roughly what it is. You also had Sinn Féin, but at the time, like let's just say back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, at the time Sinn Féin, sorry, let's just say after the Civil War, right?
Mm-hmm.
You had Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and Sinn Féin was an abstentionist party. They didn't recognize the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, and they believed that it was a usurpation of the actual Irish Republic. So they weren't really involved in constitutional politics. You know, it was really they kind of left it to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and there were smaller parties like Labour, and so on. But it was predominantly those two big parties, and they would always get either 49 or 51% of the vote. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and it was very much like the Republicans and Democrats, not as strongly divided as certainly they are nowadays. You know, I mean, like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but but like the Republican view and the pro treaty view were formed in the prism of post Civil War. They really did believe in what they believed in, and they were trying their best to put forward their principles. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that's changed massively over a period of time. Like, I don't want to be the person to say this because it sounds very negative, but you know, with a lot of politicians now, you close your eyes and you wouldn't know who's talking. I mean, like
Yeah.
they're all very much the same.
They are. They are.
Mm-hmm.
I remember being at they have youth wing political party events, you know, Ogra Sinn Féin, Ogra Fianna Fáil, Ogra Fine Gael. You close your eyes and like bar one or two talking points, they're all the
Mm-hmm.
same. They all go to, a high end college. They're all trying to get a law degree, and none of them come from the areas they mean to represent.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you know, it's like what Groucho Marx said. here are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have others.
I never heard that one. Yeah. That's a great one for politicians. It really is. Yeah.
So Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, decided to go into power sharing together, which to a certain extent, when you look at the Civil War thing, it kind of says, well, we're just going to forget about all that, which some people welcome, but at the same time, it's worth having some principles fighting for. So they got rid
Yeah.
of those principles. They went together for power sharing and power, and essentially now the largest opposition party would be Sinn Féin, and they're gaining traction. And I think it's funny, like we're talking about, the national question and reunification of Ireland and all that kind of stuff. But in reality, like a lot of the issues plaguing Ireland at the moment are bread and butter issues. Like the housing crisis in Ireland is really bad. I
Mm.
mean, like there's a lot of people who are like, people who are working, you know, every day of the week, and they're just struggling to get by and struggling to get a house. And on issues like that, like, Sinn Féin have made very large gains, in a political sort of, they're getting people from a political background that wouldn't have been their grassroots to begin with. Their grassroots, by and large, would people be, Irish Republican, um, certainly in border areas as well, where they want to get rid of partition, and that's understandable. But now they're getting people who are probably from, upper middle class kind of backgrounds, giving them a go because they can't afford a house, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
They may not share their views on a 32 county republic, but everyone has issues at the moment with housing and other issues like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
At the moment.
What's the general attitude towards the North now? Is there any talk about reunification, or has it all kind of, since the peace treaty and all that, has it all kind of went falling into the background? Is there still violence going on up there?
Yeah, so it's interesting you say that. I mean, like, uh, it ebbs and flows. There's uh, it's not the same level, obviously, of violence that we saw during the Troubles, not by a long shot. But you're seeing like the political situation there. I said before, and it's not an insult to anybody who lives in the North, but it is I think, a fair assessment of the political situation up there. It is quagmire. It's just there's a stagnation there essentially. So basically, very recently, Sinn Féin made massive gains in the North, so that the first minister would be a Sinn Féin first minister.
Okay, is that the person in charge?
Yeah,
Yeah.
essentially.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
They're the most popular party.
Like the senator, maybe, like the senator of a state. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
And the demographics showed for the first time that the Catholics were close to becoming a majority.
Mm-hmm.
You'd respond to that saying, well, look, great, we'll, allow them to become first minister. They got elected to that position. And now the loyalist parties, particularly the DUP, have pulled out of the power sharing agreement because they don't want to see Sinn Féin become first minister. And essentially, to be honest, it's not even about Sinn Féin. Unfortunately, there seems to be some fairly sectarian overtones to this. It's predominantly about having a Catholic in there.
Mm.
I don't think I'm overstepping my bounds by saying that. I think the real problem is it's kind of showing a generation of people in the North that all this hope and aspiration for political solutions over the last like 20, 30 years, you know, if the DUP can just wash that away with a swipe of a hand, and
Mhm.
it's approved by the British government as well to a large extent, that is that's a real sticking point, for constitutional politics.
Yeah, you're blowing off the whole democratic process, right? If the majority of people voted for these people, and you can just walk away because you don't like the outcome, I yeah, I would hope we were past that kind of sectarian stuff, but obviously not.
No, hey, look, it's going to take a long time. I mean, I think that the real problem they have up there is that for the last, I can't actually don't know exactly how long it's been on this particular stint. They don't have an acting executive up there. They don't actually have a active government at the moment up there.
Really.
So
Mm.
yeah, and there's a lot of other issues in like a post-war kind of situation. So I mean, like people who are involved in paramilitarism up there in the north, particularly in I don't mean to single them out, but it does seem to be prevalent in that particular community. the loyalist background, like the UDA and UVF, they're still there,
Mm.
still operating very overtly, which is very worrying to most
Yeah.
people. And they're being consulted by British politicians. So they have a thing called the Loyalist Community Council, where they have representatives of Red Hand Commando, UDA, and UVF, basically dictating terms to political figures. And you're thinking to yourself,
Mm.
if this is a little bit dodgy, and even if you remove the paramilitarism away from it, all those organizations are heavily involved in drug dealing. I mean, like large quantities of methamphetamines, cocaine, all the
Mm.
rest. I mean, are being run by these loyalist paramilitary groups. So
Mm.
I mean, like either way, it's not a good look for the British government to be dealing with these people.
Yeah. Is it generally considered economically? Is it better to live in the north or the south?
Currently, it's better to live in the south
It
economically.
is.
I think there's been people would talk about it's easier to buy a house in the north, etc., but there's less opportunity for work in the north as well.
Mm.
I mean, like essentially, I think what the problem with the north is, and I think we see it an awful lot, is that a lot of young, educated people from the north tend to leave the north almost after leaving college.
For the south or for a foreign country?
You go to the south, either go to the south, or if they're from a loyalist background, they go to the UK
Mm-hmm.
or elsewhere. But either way, you're getting a brain drain from the north.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So basically, yeah, ever since more or less, it's been a slow trend, but ever since actual partition, there's been almost an inverse trend with regards to prosperity with regards to the south and the north.
Mm.
Like,
Yeah.
people used to think after the troubles things would improve in the north, but they've kind of stymied. While in the Republic, economically, we've actually increased massively,
Wow.
particularly in our service sector.
Mhm.
So
Interesting. Irish Civil War, man. So after Lynch got killed, it all kind of filtered out, right? It all kind of faded away, generally.
and I mean, it went away to a certain extent. I mean, like there's always going to be that small cohort of people that were still intent on, number one, a united Ireland, but also believe that British government would never willingly give up things like the North without a fight.
Mm.
And like I don't mean to, I don't want to promote any acts of political violence or whatever. I certainly eschew that and all that, but at the same time, do I think the people, if we're talking about the Troubles, do I think they would have gotten where they got and getting a peace agreement without 30 years of insurgency and violence? Probably not.
No.
That's
No.
probably what
They
happened.
would. Nope.
They wouldn't. Unfortunately, they wouldn't.
Again, like all this, an aftermath of this War of Independence and this brutal civil war as well.
Yeah, it's funny. It's still ingrained in Irish society and the Irish psyche very, very much. A lot of bitterness there. Oisín, thank you so much, man. That was very interesting. Sitting in your car in the parking lot at the hospital. When are you coming back to the States?
I'm actually dropping in. I have an interview in February. I'm coming out after that.
Okay. Will you be in this area, North Carolina?
I'm heading into North Carolina.
All right. We're going to go shoot, man. We're going to go out to Coleman's Creek and shoot some long guns.
Deadly.
All right. Okay, brother. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. Hey, go ahead and like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. And if you're on the podcast, you can support us. And we'll try to get Oisín back again because he loves talking about the Irish Civil War. All right. Thanks, Oisín. All right. Bye.